of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the panel, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 192nd program of our forum. Also on behalf of the panel, it is a very special privilege this evening to welcome our guest, who is John C. Eckerson. Mr. Eckerson is certainly known as an expert on the Pacific Northwest history, and particularly the period 1820 to 1840. He is known for his great knowledge of a very well-known historical figure, Old Bill Williams. May I also give you some additional background? Our guest is a history buff who has done careful research on not only Old Bill Williams, but many other historical figures of our past. He has a theoretical flair for dramatizing the work of these individuals. Besides being an accomplished actor, he is a former professional photographer, a policeman, a circus clown, a nightclub and TV performer, and is indeed an acknowledged authority on muzzle-loading firearms of the period of the early 1800s. Mr. Eckerson, on behalf of the panel, I welcome you to our program.
Thank you. One thing, though, I might take exception to, and this is being referred to as an expert. An X is a has-been, and a spurt is a drip under pressure.
Okay, that's a good way to start the program. I also want to welcome back our three regular panel members. To my far left is Mary Lou Reed, who has a bachelor's degree from Mills College and did graduate work in religion at Columbia University. Welcome back, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
Also, welcome back to Dr. Ken Wright, who is chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences at North Idaho College, holding a PhD from the University of Idaho. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Tony.
And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome back once again Janelle Burke, who holds a bachelor's degree from the College of Idaho and a master's degree from the University of Indiana, and is the former dean of women at Idaho State University. Welcome.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, John, you have a very colorful background. You were a circus clown, a nightclub entertainer, photographer. How did you get interested in mountain men?
Like probably most of the reasons for getting into all of these other things. You start off as a hobby, you get so involved in it, the next thing you know, you got to try and make a living out of it.
Well, how did you come upon Bill Williams? Is he a favorite of yours?
He is. Not because he was a pleasant character. He's probably the orneriest, meanest old reprobate that ever come into the mountains. But the fact that he is colorful, starting off as a Methodist preacher and turning into what he did, cantankerous, ornery, mean, would steal the nickel off of a dead man's eyes if given a chance, just makes him colorful enough to want to adapt him.
Well, I'm sorry you weren't in color. You're sitting there in a very interesting costume. Would you perhaps like to explain, do you consider these the typical dress of the mountain man? Would you like to tell us what you've got on?
Regardless of opinions of some, that there's no such thing as a uniform for the mountain men. They wore what they could find when they could get it. Preferred wool or cloth. And in the mountains, this would wear out. So they resorted to the skins, buckskin, this type of thing. But it was a hodgepodge of everything. And just as likely as not to be seen wearing a blanket coat with buckskin leggings or even a frock coat with a tie at times, at rendezvous times. Sometimes they'd even cache their fine belongings, come back to it just before the rendezvous season, dig them up, and hope that they were still there.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright.
I don't know whether to call you John or Bill because you played the role of Bill Williams so well. I guess we should call you John, though, on the program, right?
Well, I was hatched with that.
How long have you been doing the Bill Williams act?
This has been about 5 years now.
Were you some other kind of a entertainer or nightclub act? Did you have some other kind of act prior to this time?
No, before I got into this, I'd spent some time in commercial photography. The nightclub and the television work goes back many years ago to... Just as I commented when we came into the studio, my first television job was with one of the first commercial television stations in UHF back east, and with only one camera. And this was when one man did everything. In between setting up the props, you were working the floor, you were a camera jockey, you were booth announcer, you were doing everything with 2 hands. Preferably, if you were born with 4 hands, you were better off.
Well, even with our low budget production, why we're a little better off than that.
You have a fine setup.
Right now. Did you phase into this slowly? You're Bill Williams actor. When you started doing it, was that exclusively what you did as a nightclub?
No, it was an accident. It was a folk festival, and there was a liars contest, and I was touted into entering the liars contest.
Janelle Berg.
It's estimated by one authority that the average lifespan of the mountain man the trapper in the mountains was about 4 years. I wonder if you could tell us what took place during that year. What was his life like during that year? A little bit about the rendezvous and what time of the year he trapped and how he might have gotten his job.
Well, it would start off, high point of the year was rendezvous. And I think this is probably where we had begun the trapper's year, because this was the beginnings of the entire year following. Most of the mountain men wintered in the mountains, and a good percentage of them were married into and lived with the tribes. There were a few that would go back to St. Louis or down to Taos, but their supply point was the rendezvous, and once a year they got their winter supplies. And they'd start off with, say, 3 pounds of powder, which really doesn't seem like much, but this would get them by. A few pounds of lead, some coffee, if they were married, whatever it would take to keep their women satisfied, which was quite a lot. Washington Irving dealt with that quite a little bit. And leaving rendezvous, he would begin his trapping season in the fall. Trap until the winter would be so bad that he couldn't trap anymore, then lay up until probably February and trap until the spring thaws or the fur was worthless again to the summer, and then look forward to rendezvous. Rendezvous being the high point of the whole year. And this is where the supplies were brought out for St. Louis at a markup. Things like a Hudson's Bay blanket that would sell for 75 cents in St. Louis was $14 in the mountains. A Hawk and rifle that was $12 in St. Louis was $150 in the mountains. A pound of coffee that was 14 cents in St. Louis was $2 a pound in the mountains. They had inflation long before we realized what it was amounted to. They were paying many of the prices that we're paying today for things.
Can you tell us where the rendezvous were held?
They would vary.
What are some of the famous rendezvous places?
The famous rendezvous were on the Wind River. This was probably one of the most famous. There was a couple of them on the Wind River. The Popeyagie, the Green. There was the first 2 rendezvous were on the eastern slope of the Rockies. Gradually they built up till 34 through 37 were really the greatest of the rendezvous.
What was the rendezvous like?
Oh, wow.
Tell us a story about the rendezvous.
Well, I think any stories that you can tell about the rendezvous are probably true stories. More colorful than any lie you can think of. The drinking ability of the mountain men, which was fantastic. Not so much their capacity to drink alcohol and to hold it, but to do what they did with what they had to work with. For one thing, your supplies were brought out from St. Louis by pack mule. You could only carry so much product on the back of a mule. So good whiskey or brandy was out of the question except for the bourgeois. That's the bosses. They'd bring out pure 190 proof, straight grain, rip-roaring alcohol, packed in flat kegs that would just nestle against the side of a mule. Lordy, not even the mountain men could drink that stuff. They had to cut it. And they'd take river water or swamp water or anything with a little mud in it to settle it down. Handful of red pepper to give it flavor, and a chaw of tobacco for color, and rattlesnake head or 2 for body. And that was their drinking whiskey. And from then on, it was go for broke. There was brawling, loving, trading. They were trading for everything from a pound of powder to next year's wife. This would last for a couple of weeks, and then hangovers and thumping heads, they'd saddle up and head back to wherever they were going to spend their trapping seasons.
Lou Reed.
Well, you were billed into the college under a title of Tall Tales and Folklore. During Rendezvous, did they try and have these line contests and big tall tales? Was this a time when they really did exchange big stories about what they'd been doing over the year? Did something develop along that line?
I don't think you'd say that it would be exactly something that come from rendezvous. Wherever you got 3 or 4 mountain men together, a lot of them, a good percentage of them, were illiterate. Those that weren't would teach the others with a volume of Shakespeare or the Bible or whatever they happened to have for reading material, but by and large it was just the stories. And many of the stories were based on truth. Like John Coulter and Bridger, were probably the earliest white men to see the Yellowstone country and talk about the geysers and the mud flats and the boiling springs. They were considered liars. So taking a little element of truth like that, embellishing it, they came up with some of these campfire stories that would be passed around, just like today with our stories that'll start off here, and by the time it gets to someplace else, it's still the same story, but completely changed.
Did they have a special sort of sense of exaggeration? One story that I'd love to have you repeat, if you would, was about the grizzlies and the geese.
Oh, well, I think
did you do that?
This is probably one that respect for your weapon, because the mountain man, his prized possession, his lifesaver would have been his rifle. And he always had it not too far away, like old Mischief Maker here. She's showing her age and her use somewhat, and being a flint gun, she still does a good job. She does such a good job that I recall a time a rat hunting me up some winter's meat, and come across the creek and looked across there. Was a fine 3-point buck standing over there, about to level old Mischief Maker out there on that there deer. And behind me I heard this crashing, thumping, and a snorting, and here come tumbling down the hill where the meanest, ferociousest grizzly bear had seen since this child had went from a pup, and that's a fact. That there bear weren't meaning to play. Well, sir, turned from the bear and looked over to that there deer, and as I did, right under my feet, coiled and ready to strike, was a big old rattlesnake. Well, this is what you call being the trouble between the devil and the deep. So just for a second, I raised my eyes up to the heavens to ask the Lord, what am I going to do now? But right over my head, there was a whole flock of geese. I had no more time to cogitate on that none. I turned right fast, aimed old Mischief Maker out on a flat rock, and torched her off. That there rifle ball ricocheted off of the flat rock, killed the deer. A chip of that rock flew back over my shoulder, got the bear right in the eye, killed him dead on a wedge. I turned right fast, wrapped my gun butt down there on that snake's head so hard, the ramrod jumped clean out from under the barrel, impaled 12 of them geese. They fell right at my feet. Well, I was surprised. I was so surprised, I fell in the creek. And when I clumb out to take my shirt off, I found I caught me a whole mess of fish. And that there kept me and my whole camp in meat for a whole winter and then some odd, and that's a fact.
And that's a fact, thank you.
Dr. Wright.
John, I'd like to go back to Bill Williams a little bit. You told us sort of why you picked Bill Williams out. Can you tell us a little bit more about him, when he lived, and how much is really known about the Finnick, Bill Williams?
There's quite a bit. He was a well-documented character, and he wasn't. He was not brilliant, perhaps, but he could read and write. And there's records of his bookkeeping, for instance, his trading. He was a Methodist preacher, as I said, and came across the river, was fascinated by the Osages, and was planning on converting them. This was his ministry. And the true thing is that the Osages ended up converting him. From there, instead of going directly to the mountains, so in 1821, he drifted down to the Santa Fe Trail as a surveyor and helped lay out the original Santa Fe Trail, and from there into Taos. By this time, Beaver was the prime target for just about every white man going across into the plains or into the Rockies. He took up trapping, and from that time on, became more and more, I don't know whether you would say degenerate or a loner or what. As in later years, probably the best documentation on him is Frederick Ruxton, as an Englishman, novelist, as it were, but he took the mountain men and made a believable, and even today, considering the Victorian writing style, made a thoroughly enjoyable running commentary on the mountain men. He featured quite a bit of the character of old Bill Williams. Later documentation on him shows that he was with the Utahs and lived with the Utahs for quite some time. And the last expedition of Fremont, Kit Carson at that time had been Fremont's guide. Carson was unable to make it, and the last major thing that Williams did was as the guide for the last Fremont expedition. Unfortunately, Mr. Fremont wouldn't listen to Bill Williams, and they got wintered in. Most of the party was killed by this winter. A few of them got loose, and Williams was one of them. And he went back to the mountains the next summer to try and salvage what was left of the equipment. And his former relatives caught up with him and did him under for a reason. Seems like a year or two before, the Utahs had given Bill Williams their furs to take into Taos to trade, and instead of coming back home with the trade goods, he went on a rip-roaring drunk. Then from that time, figured he'd better not go back. He joined in a little battle with the U.S. Army against the Bannocks, who were related to the Utahs. He was spotted there, and from that time on, there was a contract out on old Bill Williams. He made it to age 67 or 68, which by mountain man standard was a pretty good ripe old age to stay in the mountains that long.
What year did he finally see his end then? You know the date?
This, I'd have to go back and think of that because there's so many dates cluttering up my mind on that. The last Fremont expedition, which was, well, that was prior to the Civil War, wasn't it? It would have to be. Yes.
Jim Elbert.
It wasn't loaded.
Jim Elbert.
According to the Joint Occupancy Treaty, 1818, the Pacific Northwest was jointly being held by Great Britain and also by the U.S. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the trading that went on between the two companies, because there was a lot of differences between the Americans and the British, and how the mountain men kind of worked into this system, how the Americans differed from the British mountain men, or British trading companies.
Well, there's quite a bit of difference, and the main interchanges between the British, like the Hudson's Bay or the Northwest Company prior to their merger, and the American mountain men wasn't trade for goods, it was just man-stealing. The Americans were out to get the beaver, and so were the Hudson's Bay or the Northwest people. To do this, they wanted the trappers, and they would go to just about any length to take off the people from one brigade to another. The Northwest, well, I would say through the western slope of the Rockies, was pretty much left to the British, with the exceptions of the Wind River, this area. The Hudson's Bay had a good hold into the western reaches, and more or less mutual agreement that we leave this alone. The Scottish influence in Hudson's Bay or Northwest Company is probably a bigger factor than anything else, because even the mountain men, I think, would take a dim view of tangling with the Scotsmen, where they might take on the Blackfeet, but not the Scots. Dr. McLaughlin and Douglas, Henry, not Andrew Henry, but there was the Alexander Henry the Elder, Henry the Younger, both of them, Northwest Company people. They treated their people fairly in a way, but Americans gave better prices, and this in the long run was the deciding factor. I think the biggest mistake when Hudson's Bay allowed the American missionaries in, because that was the beginning of the end. The population explosion took off from there, and in 43, when the Oregon Territory finally became U.S. property, was by 2 votes. And 2 Frenchmen were those deciding factors. Otherwise, the states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho would probably still be Canadian territory if it wasn't for those 2 votes.
At one time, the British, I think, had a regulation to trap every 5 years, trap the beaver every 5 years. And then when it became apparent that there was going to be competition for the territory, they began to trap more often than that and just took the beaver out. Would that be factual?
It would be a scorched earth policy was what it was.
Yes.
Hudson's Bay wanted to leave a completely barren strip of land, which probably would have existed through most of Idaho into western Montana This way, there's no man's land where it had been worthless for any American to come across this area. The Americans tried the same thing. The tricks that were used against each other were probably no different than the tricks that are used in big business today. It's just that today we use a little more finesse about it.
I want to ask you a question, John, that you commented on earlier today, and also in the past 2 weeks we've had several guests that have been dealing with this topic, and we've been dealing with it on this program, and I'll get to your viewpoint. The fur traders and then the settlers that came to the Northwest and to all the West, and the missionaries, and then, as you indicated, the politicians, all had a tremendous effect upon the environment they moved into, and particularly my focus is the Indians that lived in the area. Would you give us your viewpoint on how these different groups treated the Indians, and do you think it was positive or negative?
It's a good question. If the mountain man would have had his way, there would probably been no significant change to the Indian's lifestyle. In fact, the convert was the mountain man. He married into the tribes. He lived as an Indian. He became more Indian in many ways than the Indian himself. Where he put his traps, there'd be less beaver. But when he left the land was just as he had found it. One of the things that I harp on quite a bit, the beginnings of the end, was the missionary, and then the politician, the farmer, the people, what we called at that time manifest destiny. I don't think that history could have done anything any different. History would have never done anything different, because there's a rhyme or a reason for everything. Unfortunately, but the treatment of the Indians by the British was considerably better than what we did, official or unofficial policy, even up to today. I think you look at Canadian history, there's not been an Indian war in Canadian history. Where every dealings we've had with every tribe, beginning with the Monongahela's in the east on right up to the Neah Bay country, has been nothing but disaster. Where in the history in this area right here, the Nez Perce, the Flathead, at no time did they show any enmity to the white. The dealings were perfectly honest. There was not even horse stealing. And yet, look what we did there. So this is a question that's not for me to answer. History has already answered it.
Lou Reed.
Well, interesting that you're saying the mountain man was a convert really to the Indian way. We interviewed a very interesting Native American last week who said that she feels in the future that everyone, white and Indians alike, will have to go back to the Indian view of the oneness of nature and of a brotherhood with each other. Do you agree with this? Do you feel that there is a need to go back to what the mountain man found in his dealings with nature and the Indians?
Very much so. The biggest problem that we've got now is just too many people to do it in the land that we've got. We've got 219 million people in this country. Remember, in the 1820s through 1840s, there probably wasn't 30 million. And this, you can add another 15,000 Western Indians, and this was the entire population of the Western Hemisphere, as far as the United States area is concerned. Whether or not 219 million people are going to be able to get back to nature and let nature support them is something else.
What other things do you feel that the mountain men picked up from the Indians? I know Lewis and Clark were not considered mountain men, but they had this Clark had this uncanny sense of direction in which he always seemed to be able to choose the right fork of the river, and the mountain men didn't get lost. Is this something that they brought to the situation, or do you think this was something that they learned from Indian living?
Billy Clark didn't have an infallible sense of direction. He was lost for about 2 months before he finally got back to Meriwether Lewis. The mountain man developed this, knowing his habitat and developing his instincts. His directional instinct was fantastic. Jim Bridger, for instance, was completely illiterate and couldn't read nor write. Yet he could sit down and draw a map in the dust and not be 5 miles off in his directions. That they would say, we'll meet at such and such rock on such and such a day, and not even having a calendar or a timepiece would be at that rock on that day, and maybe cross 1,000 miles to do it. It's instinct, and it's something that is not bred into a person. It's something that he learns, and not realizing that he learns, but it's a part of survival.
And this tremendous stamina that went along with it, these stories of how they would go, as you say, for great distances and through weather.
If they weren't tough to begin with, they wouldn't have been mountain men. They had to have something to begin with, but the stamina was something that, having a little bit of it to start, it was embellished and grew even more as they went on. And this is why out of maybe the 1,000 or 1,500 or so mountain men, which was the total that there ever was of the American mountain men during this 20-year period, 30 or 40 were survivors. The great mountain man, the greatest mountain man, was the one who died of old age, and there weren't very many of them.
Dr. Wright.
John, I'd like to get into the topic of this religion thing again, and the Indian religion and the white man religion, but we've already talked about the mountain man and his living with nature, and that which is part of a man's religion, really, the way you respect nature. I'm wondering if you think from your studies, if you're convinced the mountain man really had a respect and a reverence for nature, or whether it was just that there were so few of them and the damage they did to the land was so nominal because of their sparse population that they really weren't significantly different than other white men. What do you...
No, they were different. By and large, they inherited through marriage or through conditioning or through exposure to the Indian, they inherited his religious beliefs. And part of this was his reverence for nature. Invariably, the mountain man would turn his back on civilization to live in the mountains. They deplored what was happening during the settlers' period. They removed themselves as far away as they could from the settlement trails, with a few exceptions, and this is why that there's names like Bridger, Meek, Carson. These have come down to us as history because they stayed in a civilized environment after the fur trade was gone. But the majority of those that did live out their existence, either with the tribes or as loners, is because their love of their lifestyle, their love of their surroundings was such that they couldn't conform to the civilized pattern. As far as his religious beliefs, he found it was far superior to that of the white man's beliefs. It was freer and was probably more honest.
Janelle Bird.
What are some of the contributions of the mountain men to American civilization and our present way of life? I know names, for example, there are all kinds of names that have interesting stories, and the rivers were named by the mountain men. The Malheur River. Lots of names have come from from the mountain men. Could you tell us more things that maybe the mountain men have given us?
Oh, they gave us quite a few things. Lies, for one. Some of this old campfire
Tell us one
stories.
of those.
Some of the old campfire stories are what you consider classic folklore. They contributed knowledge, things that would have eventually been discovered, but the things that they did discover at the time were so significant that they were considered lies. And, like we mentioned, the Yellowstone country. They contributed the knowledge of the country, how to do these things, which they in turn had learned from the Indians. As far as names, places, faces, things, they didn't leave that much. It was later on that these names were given, later on by the settlers. They took the Indian philosophy of not naming things, naming the rivers. It was men like Lewis and Clark or Fremont or some of these that gave the names to the rivers and to the mountains. They took things as they were.
Can you tell us one of the folklore stories? For example, one of the campfire stories.
Oh, one of the best ones, I would say, and the most famous one, is the Putrefied Forest. This is credited to sometimes Jim Bridger and sometimes Moses Harris, but it has been embellished, and there's about 4 different variations of it. But what it amounts to is the time that they were out looking for winter camp, because it was getting bad, and the snow was built up to at least 50 foot deep. Come up over a rise and look down over that rise, and there's a green valley down there in the fresh bloom of springtime. The grass is green and flowers, there's birds singing in the trees. Well, hooray for summer doings, they says, and go on down there and turns their horses and mules loose so as they could graze, and stood back just plumb amazed, because them critters would take a mouth of that there grass and spit it out just like it's your poison. Come to find out, it weren't really like grass at all. It were more like glass, just as brittle as clay pipe stems. Well, certainly one of the fellows throwed a rock up to one of them birds and hit it, and it just disintegrated into 1,000 pieces. Well, now, young Billy Sutlet, who'd just been into the mountains, thought he was some educated, and he said, what we is into here is a putrefied forest. Well, sir, this here old child, being educated too, reasoned with him and says, why, you little wet behind the ears, pork-eating greenhorn, if you'd have knowed what you thought you knowed, you'd have knowed a putrefied thing can't, why don't it stink? Well, we was into there, and figured might be catching. And we didn't want to turn into nothing putrefied ourselves. So we'd come out of there as fast as we could. And old Rosie and me, we were breaking trail. Rosie being the mule, and she were a smart one. Come up on a canyon rim and looking down off on the edge, I reckon that thing must have been 1,000 foot if it were a yard, and a mile across. Next thing you know, old Rosie come up and puts 1 foot off on the edge of that. I tried to hold her back, and she wouldn't hold back none. She gets both feet off on the edge, and lordy, lordy, I figured this child's a gone beaver for sure this time. Next thing, she's got all 4 feet off, and there she is, just walking across like it were on a bridge. That there mule were smart. Why, she knowed that being a putrefied forest is a tore everything were putrefied. Even the lower gravity were putrefied, and that's a fact.
Louise.
Tell me more. I want more stories. Who was Moses Harris?
Moses Harris was called Black Harris. Nobody really knows, the moment of the mountain men. You didn't know where they came from, who they were, where they went after they left the mountains. What we've got is left of the description of him called Black Harris. It was written by Ruxton, describing him as having a complexion that was so dark that it looks as if he had been shot up close and was powder burns. The stories that he told were probably more famous than Bridger, and I sometimes think that Bridger had a tendency to lift some of Black Harris's stories. And it's hard to say I wasn't there, regardless of what people, how old they think I am.
How about Joe Meek?
Joe Meek was probably everybody's favorite mountain man. He left the mountains after the fur trade petered out and moved on into the Willamette Valley and settled in. When Oregon became the United States territory, was appointed as the first delegate with his mission to go back to Washington, D.C. to convince the Senate that they should be ratified, the treaty should be ratified. Didn't have a dime, but he took off anyway. Rode from horseback to horseback as a fresh horse when he'd wear one out, and got as far as St. Louis, wearing his greasy old buckskins, conned himself on to a ferry by calling himself the Ambassador Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary of the Great Republic of Oregon on his mission to the United States Capitol. Walked into the finest restaurant in Washington, D.C. in these same greasy, filthy buckskins, promoted a free meal. The next day walks into the office of the President of the United States, Mr. Polk, I believe it was, or Pierce, Franklin Pierce, escorted by all of these people that were waiting in these same greasy, filthy buckskins into the office of the president. Thereupon he shook hands with his uncle, President Pierce. When he left, he came back to Oregon as the first United States Marshal of the Oregon Territory.
Oh, he was a success. How about Judd Smith, who lost his group? Did I get that name right? Was it Judd Smith?
He's admired. Very much admired. Of course, this is personal opinion. I don't know why. He never trapped much beaver. Though he was a partner in the first Rocky Mountain Fur Company, he never trapped much beaver. He did cover a lot of country. And on one trip alone, he lost almost his entire brigade with the exception of one man, to the Mojaves on one side of the Sierras and to the Umpquas on the other side. Managed to get up to Fort Vancouver, where in order to get transportation back to his own country, he lost what furs he had captured. A year later, he heads on down and the Comanches lift his hair. He wasn't that successful a mountain man.
He's about as good as Custer. How about, I have one more name here, Hugh Glass?
Oh, Hugh Glass. clawed by and chawed by a grizzly bear, left for dead, crawled on his hands and knees 300 miles to Fort Kiowa, finally gathered back his possessions and went up to the ones that took them from him. He lived another 12 years. He was reasonably successful. He was finally, the Rees finally got to him, but he was in his 60s by that time.
Dr. Wright.
This is authentic then about Hugh Glass. This is not a
No, that was very,
fable.
very true. That was very true.
Pretty well documented that he really did.
Really, something
attack
that
by a grizzly.
he was probably a seaman or a sea captain captured by Lafitte's pirates in the Gulf, got loose from them, was captured by the Pawnee, was adopted into the tribe, and then Ashley's first expedition up the Missouri joined them the rest of his life. He was a mountain man.
About 3 or 4 years ago, I don't remember the exact time, there was a movie called Jeremiah Johnson about a mountain man. Is there any truth to this, or is this completely a fictional story?
It's based on truth, based on the story of John Johnson, commonly called Liver-Eating Johnson. Very loosely based, because I don't think that if they had taken the true story of Liver-Eating Johnson, made a major motion picture of it, it would have come out with a GP rating. He was quite a character.
Tell us about him.
He came into the mountains quite late. The fur trade had already gone downhill by the time he came in, which was 43. He was a wolfer, really, trapping or poisoning wolves either way. He did marry a flathead. He was very much in love with her. The crow did kill her, not because, as the picture showed, but because it just happens that the crow and the flatheads didn't get along. He was gone off on a winter hunt or on a fairly long hunt and left her behind. From that time, he declared war on the Crow Nation, and for over a 20-year period, killed 300 crow. His trademark was to take the liver out. No one ever saw him eat that liver. But it was quite a mark, a coup mark. He gained such honor with the crow that there was, over this period of time, over 20 volunteers that had one purpose in life, was to hunt down and kill Liver-Eating Johnson. He survived every one of them. Finally made peace with the crow 20 years later. Went on an expedition with the crow against the Sioux. And Delview, can't think of the other, there were several white trappers that went with him, wanted to see him eat a liver. Well, he opened up the Sioux, took the liver out, took one bite of it and spat it out, saying Sioux liver wasn't as sweet as crow liver. So we still don't know whether Liver-Eating Johnson was actually eating crow livers. He went on from there to become a peace officer, a marshal in the smaller towns, and died in 1901 in the Veterans Hospital in Los Angeles, California, of old age.
Janelle Burke.
How did the mountain man trap his beaver? What kind of trap did he use, and how did he set it?
He used a number 3 trap, which was about like so. He would make a water set, stake it down. The chain would be on a stake. Bring the trap to shallower water. Over this, and to the trap, he would have his float stick, so that when a trap did go to deeper water, this float stick would be above it to show where it went down. Over the trap, he would take a bait, which was castoreum, from the musk glands of the beaver, on a stick. And this would attract any beaver in the area. To over the trap, he'd step on the trap. First reaction of the beavers to go for deep water, and he would drown immediately, which really was not painful. It was a rather humane way of trapping beaver. It was worse on the mountain man, because his trapping was done between October through November and December until the streams froze up to the point where they couldn't work them. And again, from the earliest thaws, which would probably in February, up until April, where the summer fur would come in and be worthless. He would make his set maybe several hundred yards from where he stepped into the water, wading this ice-cold mountain stream down to set his traps, wade another couple hundred yards down to back up on the bank to his next trap. He would work maybe 6 traps that way, doing this maybe twice a day, in and out. Those that did live to die of old age, who had chronic rheumatism.
Can you tell us how much money was taken out of the territory in beaver skins? Give us some idea.
Thousands of dollars. When General Ashley, who was the first promoter of the American trapping scene, the rendezvous, as it were, left the Missouri to the forts. He began his rendezvous season. He began trapping, worked only 2 years, sold out, and retired into St. Louis as an extremely wealthy man, wealthy enough to where he could play with politics from that time on. To the mountain man, the trapper, when prime beaver in 1835, say, was going for $5 a plume, which would be a skin. It was darn fine money in those days when you stop to think about bringing in $30,000 worth in a year's time. But the Italy rendezvous dead broke. It was the traders that made it, not the trappers.
Where did he put his skins so they wouldn't be stolen? It would seem to me he'd be always having to look over his shoulder to make sure he didn't lose his skins.
Yeah, and he did quite often. His skins and his horses and sometimes his hair. But if they were moving or migrating, they'd make a cache. And the way this was done would we start off with a small hole, just small enough to where they could get a pack of beaver, which would be a bale of around 90 pounds. Into this hole, from the hole it funnels out into a den below. Then cover this up again, build a campfire over it, and hope nobody got wind that there was a cache there. Sometimes the caches were raided, and quite often, though, they came back to their possessions.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Hugh Glass got gnawed by a grizzly, and you've mentioned grizzlies several times. Were they a real threat, and what did mountain men do when they ran into a grizzly?
Same thing you do with a grizzly now, run like hell. The grizzly bear in those days was probably more numerous than the Indians, or more vicious. There were probably more trappers killed by grizzly bear than there were by Indians. They had no fear, and they were almost unkillable. And you had to hit the right shot or enough guns to do it. And using your single-shot muzzle-loading rifle, it was touch and go. And no one really went out to hunt grizzly bear with the intention of hunting grizzly bear unless they'd been into some of their wildcat whiskey. Then they might do it. One story that's told of Billy Sutlitt, and several of them were being trapped by a grizzly, run up the trees, and everybody got up into the trees except Sutlitt, who was pumping so hard climbing and was so excited that he wasn't getting anywhere. He was still sitting on the ground. He was still going like crazy. And for some reason or the other, the bear didn't bother him. There were some that weren't so successful. Others, like Joe Meek and can't remember who they were, decided to go on a bear hunt. Well, they were well fortified. There were 3 bear in a cave. And Joe went in, tried to get the bear to come out, and they wouldn't come out. The only way they could do this, Joe would go in, wrap one bear across the snout with his ramrod, get out of the way, the bear would come out, and then they would shoot the bear. Did this with all 3 of them. And as you remember through Jeremiah Johnson, where the young pilgrim comes into the mountains and the old-timers teaching him the ropes, and can you skin a bear? Well, I can skin anything you bring me. Well, you wait here, and the next thing he comes up and down with his bear on his tail. The kid runs into the cabin, the bear runs in after him, the old man runs out the other side, both doors are shut, and he's laughing like crazy. Now, this is in the movie Jeremiah Johnson, which is supposedly a true happening. Not necessarily to John Johnson, but it supposedly truly happened, and knowing the mountain man's sense of humor, it's quite possible.
Dr. Wright.
That's incredible. I want to ask you about the gold. You mentioned that the period of the mountain men was essentially the period of the fur trade, and when the fur trade died, why the mountain men drifted off, lived with the tribes, or went back to civilization. Did many of them become miners, and if not, why not? Because it seems to me like with gold, although the beaver was bringing a prime price at one time, gold certainly has had a lot of value for many years, and they could have made a fortune in gold if they had cared to.
That was the whole secret right there, if they had cared to. They knew there was gold in the area. They had no idea how to go about it, but they knew there was gold in there. Some of the travels of Bridger, he's mentioned finding gold, and several of the others. They didn't want it for the simple reason, by the time the fur trade had petered out, there were very few of them left that gave a hoot and a holler about how wealthy they were. Their measure of wealth was just as with the people they were living with, not in gold, but in the number of horses you had or the amount of meat you had dried for the winter. I wanted no part of it. There was a few that went out to as a 49er, and a few that went into the Colorado gold rushes after that. But we have no real history of them, because by that time they weren't mountain men anymore, and they had probably come into the mountains so late that they never did fit into the picture to begin with. There was undoubtedly measures of gold that was taken out and used, but the mountain man, the last thing in the world he wanted was the galloping herd coming out into his country. So those that knew about any bonanzas probably kept their mouths pretty quiet about it.
Janelle Burke.
Can you tell us something about the Indian tribes with which the mountain man worked? What tribes did he find compatible? Which tribes did he fear, if he did fear any of them? But which tribes, how did he work with the Indians in the Pacific Northwest?
Reasonably well. The exception being the Blackfeet, who never got along with anybody. This isn't necessarily because of an inherent antagonism against everybody. I think historically what we find is that Blackfeet were more loyal to Hudson's Bay Company, and Hudson's Bay being in such a controversial position against the American mountain men put them up to much of the shenanigans. The white men identified more closely with the Nez Perce and the Flathead. Though people like Bridger, Old Bill Williams, Joe Meek preferred Shoshone. Some married into the Crow. Others, a few, the Sioux, quite a few into the Cheyenne. The Southwest, some into the Apache, very few into the Comanche. But whichever tribe they married into, they accepted their duties, because in those days, when you married, say, Shoshone, you not only took the girl, but you took mother, father, aunt, grandfather, uncles, cousins, the whole nation just about was your relative. And if you were married a Shoshone, you fought the Sioux. Or if you married a Sioux, you fought the Crow. So there wasn't any one point of things except that as the man became identified by being married to a Cheyenne, he became so Cheyenne that his scalp was fair game for the hereditary enemies of his tribe. The possible exception being the Blackfeet. Once in a while, everybody would get together and fight the Blackfeet.
John, I think this is a very appropriate time to stop with the questions for a moment and let you describe a musical instrument that you have with us, what it is, and identify it. And then if you'll be so kind as to take a minute or two, we'd like for you to do a number on that as you did to the student body today. I think it's very lovely.
Commonly called a squeeze box or a squawk box. Concertina, and probably would have been something that the mountain man would have carried. And he, like myself, doesn't play it well, but loudly. But I like to think that trail being ended, and I say that the mountain man wasn't a religious man. But the one song that would come close to being the mountain man's hymn, it's not really a hymn at all. It's a song. It's a song about a river and an Indian gal and the men who went across the wide Missouri.
Thank you. Lou Reed.
What did you call your gun?
Old Mischief Maker.
Oh, Mischief Maker. You are a gun collector, or you just have done quite a bit of studying about the old muzzle loading?
Both. Enjoy them, enjoy the historical content. I think particularly your Eastern long rifle, your Pennsylvania, what you would commonly call your Kentucky rifle, is one of the few things that you say is really a truly American art form, because more than a weapon, they are an artistic endeavor, and they're a beautiful thing. Everything the maker had in his brain and his fingertips went into making this not only a usable piece, but a work of art.
Your mountain man, did he have a special feeling about his gun? Is this
very much so? That was as good as his right arm.
Yeah.
It saved his life more than once.
But you do that little bit you did about who I am, the lightning and the thunder.
Back to the old Missouri River days, where a man is challenged to another man, and where you don't want to cross trails with them or expect somebody else to cross a trail with you. I'm a Salt River roarer and looking for trouble. I was born in the thunderclouds, sired by a Lutton and Bolton. My mama was a grizzle bear. My brother's the hurricane, and my sister's is the plague and the pestilence. When I walk the ground, the earth trembles and the mountains fall down. When I thirst, every stream for miles around runs dry. I can outride, out-trap, out-fight, out-drink, out-love, or out anything else any other two-legged critter can do this or the other side of the Missouri. I'm half horse, half alligator, and all mean.
Dr. Wright.
John, I want to ask you about some modern mountain men, if there is such a thing. You've studied the mountain men of the era of the fur trapping days prior to the Oregon Trail migrations, and we've still got people who live in the mountains, the hermits. Have you paid much attention to what we'd call the modern mountain man? I'm thinking of one particularly in this area that is best known around Idaho, known as Buckskin Billy. He lived on the central reaches of the Main Salmon River, and his real name is Sylvan Hart.
Right.
How would you rank him with the mountain men of old?
I think he's done a very good job of it. I've never had the pleasure of meeting him. I've known several of the fellows from down in the Oregon country around Bend that have made a trip over to see him. I'd like very much to one of these days. But he's not the only one. I think the fact that he's so well known is because some New Yorker managed to get a book published about him. There's others. There's some that I know over around Snohomish County in Washington. There's more down in Grants Pass area in Oregon, in Montana. Though just the fact that one man had publicity. The fact, though, that the day of the independent, totally independent mountain man, I don't think we'll see. He's to the point now the livelihood as such, the game isn't there that it used to be. The methods of taking the game were changed. There's still an interdependence, too much so on civilization, mainly because of this 219 million people we were talking about earlier.
So the real mountain man is no longer, and these fellows are a good attempt, but they're not really quite the same because of the inroads of civilization.
They're trying to hang on to what they've got before it melts, and I hope that it'll last long enough for them to achieve some kind of satisfaction out of it.
Janelle Burke.
Can you tell us something about the rest of your equipment here that you have with you before we close? The other hat and this stick?
This stick. That is not a stick. That is a tomahawk. It is used, this one's used for, well, you got one for throw and one for show. This is the show and axe. But it will take an edge, and it'll hold an edge, and it's good for chopping kindling or cutting skulls, whichever one comes first. The hat was the whole reason the mountain man was out there to begin with originally, beaver. Because beaver made felt. And felt is what made a quality hat and still does. Today you'll see a 3X or a 4X or a 5X. That's the percentage of beaver. A 3X is 30% beaver. The rest of it is nutria fur, no wool felt at all. And this is what that hat looked like when it was trapped. And your furrier would take that, your guard hairs underneath, wet it down, whip it, combine it, and it comes out felt.
John, we have a question, too, that is most contemporary. We hear much these days about so-called Bigfoot that roams the mountains. And in your study of the mountain man, have you run across any description of Bigfoot?
I ain't going to tell you. One reason, there is so nice a feeling to know that there is one little natural, unexplained thing that we cannot computerize, catalog, electrify, identify, and sell. So I am not going to say whether I have found out or not, and I hope nobody else ever finds out.
Lou Reed.
If just off the top of your head, do you have some favorite books that you might recommend to someone who is perhaps kind of curious to find out a little bit more about the history of the mountain man? Any favorite authors? A.B. Guthrie is one that I think perhaps...
His Big Sky,
Big
yes.
Sky is...
To say that, oh, wow. I think for a person that's interested enough in the authentic history of the thing, yes, A.B. Guthrie's Big Sky, which is a novel, but he treats the mountain man quite well. Another one that goes back to the 30s is Stuart Edward White's The Long Rifle. My personal preference is Long Rifle over Big Sky. But for interesting works purely on the historical side of it, nonfiction, for light reading, they want to know of the personalities or some of the individuals of the time. Winfred Blevins' Give Your Heart to the Hawks. Nash Publishing Company is probably as good a bet as any. For the purely technical background of it, the old standby classic of Bernard DeVoto's Across the Wide Missouri. Don Barry's Majority of Scoundrels. And for this, if anyone's interest isn't built up by that, then they can forget it. If their interest has built up, there's a whole field for them to go into, and they'll have incentive enough to go into it from there.
Well, I can ask you about Jeremiah Johnson as being authentic. How about Little Big Man?
It was an interesting novel.
With that, I'm going to bring our program to a conclusion. John, on behalf of the panel, it has been a very special treat having you here, and it's been most enjoyable and informative, and I know our viewing audience has also come to that conclusion. Thank you very much. I also thank our panel for, once again, outstanding questions on many areas of the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have enjoyed our program and our guest, John Eckerson. If you are interested in a particular program with this gentleman, he certainly can be reached through
Why did you tell me that with water?
through George Carlson Associates in Seattle, Washington. Again, let me invite you to be with us again next week at 6 o'clock on Channel 7, when we'll be interviewing another personality of the Northwest of the United States. And until that time, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by Videotape Recording.